stature, stand at Sinai, receive the Torah, face-to-face meeting with the Creator Himself. And these 7 weeks, they traverse the pattern of the 7 levels or the 7 energies or emanations or whatever language or jargon you care to use. And we said last week we would try to begin to explore what these dimensions, if you like, what these dimensions are. And being that this is the 3rd week or the culmination of the 3rd week, the last day or completion of the 3rd week, and the 3rd week being the concept of harmony or balance, let's see if we can try to understand this midah, as it's called, this characteristic, see if we can plumb its depth to the extent that we're able, and see perhaps if we can make it a little easier to understand by exploring 1 or 2 practical expressions. Really, these first 3 qualities, the first three weeks, these first 3 qualities of any 7-step process, or in fact a 10-step process, or 13, or it's really all the same. But these 3 form the basis, and a firm grasp of these is really a firm grasp of pretty much most of what happens in the spiritual world. The first 3 qualities, these first 3 emanations or energies, if you like, they are known perhaps as, the first is known as chesed, which we translate as, I suppose literally you translate it as kindness or loving kindness, whatever that means exactly. But it means a giving, an unlimited giving, an outpouring of self in a completely unlimited giving. The second is called gvura, which is the discipline, or the left-hand side, the concept of limitation of the giving. And the third, the one we'd like to perhaps focus on this evening, is the concept that in this particular language is known as tiferes, which in the more general term, see, there are different expressions for these. In the specific, we talk about chesed on the right, gvura on the left, and tiferes, or this particular middle quality in between. In a more general term, they're called chesed, din, and rachamim. That's the perhaps more common jargon. Chadar, as it's known in its abbreviation, chesed, din, rachamim. Chesed means the right side, din meaning strict and exacting justice or judgment on the left, and rachamim meaning, again, the English words are very, perhaps even worse than useless, because the word rachamim in English means mercy, quality of mercy, but really that doesn't at all convey the fact that it's a balance and a harmony between right and left. This harmony between opposites is a difficult thing to grasp. It's a very delicate and abstract idea, but it's the basis of being successful in all, particularly in the area of relationships, dealing with self and dealing with self with others, and therefore it's worth a thorough grasp, not only because of that, but because, perhaps even more deeply, it's the basis of all Torah thinking, which means it's the basis of the structure of the world. This is the point of harmonizing opposites in such a way that the opposites are resolved without having yielded. That, perhaps a slightly novel way to approach it might be like this. You know that this quality of harmonizing opposites is probably uniquely expressed as humor, Jewish humor particularly. That's the best example I can. We're talking about here 2 opposite qualities that have to be put together in such a way that the truth of each and its extreme clarity and its extreme polarity becomes even better and even more sharply defined. We're not talking about putting 2 things together in what you call compromise, right? Where I have to give a little bit more than I wanted and you get a little bit less than you would have liked. That's not harmony. That's compromise. We're not talking about that. We're talking about harmony is where a harmony is that in which both things are fully expressed, and yet they're different because they're in relationship to other. There's no compromise in harmony. This is the quality of putting 2 things together where the extreme opposite nature of both, neither is yielded, and yet each one becomes clearer and more, becomes clarified in relationship to its opposite. Jewish humor, this is the source of paradox. This is the source of paradox and of the Jewish comfort with paradox. Jewish humor share with you one of the oldest Jewish jokes in the book. Is that a good way to start? If you haven't heard this one, there's serious doubt about your Jewish background. I mean, check your lineage. That's the story about the man who enters the rabbi's study and has a point of litigation with his friends. The two of them come in, and the first man pours out his whole story explaining why he's right, and the rabbi thinks about it and says, "You're right." Then the other fellow pours out his story explaining why he's right, and the rabbi thinks from it and says, "You're also right." Then the rabbi's wife, who's been listening, comes in and says, "They can't possibly both be right," and the rabbi says, "You're also right." That is not as funny as it may seem, or perhaps it's funnier than it seems. That is the unique Jewish grasp of how we are perfectly comfortable with paradoxical opposites. The reason is that, and we laugh at it and we feel, the reason is that the world is built on this knife edge of paradox. The world is built that way. Right? And to be Jewish means, to be spiritual, I suppose, means to grasp the impossible nature of the world. To think that the world is completely limited and finite is a tragic mistake. To think that the world is all, that there's no such thing, that it's all a spiritual, also a mistake. The unique grasp that Judaism teaches is how the world can be an emanation, a gilui, a revelation of oneness, completely perfect and transcendent, and at the same time be vested in a physical reality which is so limited and so problematic. And neither one negates the other. Let's see if we can try to fathom this. First of all, let's start at the bottom. We're talking about, perhaps the clearest way you could put it is like this. The first quality we're talking about is the quality of beginning. But beginning without limit, beginning without end. Right? The beginning of any process, what you call yesh me'ayin, where the thing comes into existence and has no indication of its own limits. But if something's created without limit, it isn't anything. Because it will expand immediately to the full, to infinity. It cannot, to make a thing what it is, it needs a sense of definition. Definition means that it has borders. In Hebrew, the word for a definition is a hagdara. The root of that word means a gedder, a fence or an edge or a border. To define a thing means that it has to be limited. You can't. The Medrash, for example, says that the world was created by being brought into existence and began to expand at a transcendent speed. Until Hashem performed the second act of creation, which was Adshegar by him, which is a very strange expression, means until he yelled at them, at the heavens, Va'amalehem die, and he said stop. And when he said stop, they froze at the particular size that they are. There's a great mystery in that. Because the world, one of the greatest mysteries that the world presents is the fact that it is a particular size. The Kabbalists, for example, ask why there are as many stars as there are. They don't mean so many. They mean why that number? Why not less? There could have been fewer, and there's a lot of room for more. There's a lot of room for more. So why is the world created with that particular number? And the Kabbalistic answer is because that's exactly the correct number to demonstrate the oneness of Hashem. Less would have been deficient and more would have been too much. Can you appreciate that? Can you apprehend that immediately? Probably not. No, we can't. We can in its root, in its conceptual root. But in a particular number we can't, although we will eventually. So, their first action was bringing into existence that which by definition, has no limits. And the second action is the giving of limits to that thing. As soon as it has a limit, it becomes a real thing in the world. Until then, it's only a potential thing. Now, those are the first two. I mean, how many examples do we need? Example would be the first quality is called male. It's called male. The word zachar in Hebrew, which means male, has the same numerical equivalent as the word bracha, which means a blessing. The Jewish definition of blessing is that which is more. That which becomes more. Tosefes v'riboy. It means it adds and becomes more. That's called bracha. And the word for female in Hebrew is nekeva, which means that which is finite and limited. Literally. The word nekeva in Hebrew, that means female. But, see, in English, male and female simply mean male and female. But in Hebrew, they carry their meanings. Zachar means that which is always the beginning of something new. For example, the Hebrew word zecher means a memory. The same root in Hebrew that means male means memory. What is the connection? The connection is that a memory is the very least you can have of a previous state to move into a new state. That's the least. Right? A seed in Hebrew is that concept. A seed is the minimal expression of the previous stage, compressed into an infinitesimal space, which is responsible for the next, which will have its own creation of next, and so forth unto eternity. The word zikaron in Hebrew, which means a memory, has the same numerical equivalent as zera, meaning a seed. That's the male dimension, seed, which means multi-potential spark of energy. The female, nekeva in Hebrew, means to make finite. Like you say, it says in Pasuk, Nakva scharcha elai ve'etene. Quote your salary, give me a figure and I'll pay you. Quote me, when Yaakov worked for Lavan said to him, give me a figure and I'll pay you. But you have to give me a figure. Until there's a number, until you've put the female quality of a finite edge, a number, you don't have payment. See, the paradox is that if someone says, quote me a figure and I'll pay you, you're caught immediately in a fascinating dilemma, paradox. Because what happens is, when someone says, look, quote me a figure, any figure you want, I'll pay you. So what happens is the numbers start reeling. They go faster and faster and faster. But as the numbers increase, and you know you're going to get whatever you ask for, as soon as you say a figure. But you're caught in the horns of that very painful dilemma, which is that as long as you allow the number to expand and increase, you have nothing. It's only when you finally put a figure to it that you get... And in that moment of being paid is a tremendous blessing of the male, that number that has been reached, and the limitation of the female that it's not more. That's why our sources say that the creation of the world itself is an expression of exile. The creation of the world is the root of evil. Of course it's the root of good, make no mistake. But it's the root of... That means the world itself, as soon as it comes into focus and condenses, crystallizes, concretizes into its form, you have there the very beginning of the expression of limitation. Because it's no more than what it is. Of course the blessing is that it is now. But the curse, so to speak, the Hebrew word nekeva also means a curse. Female. Curse means, for example, in Choseh, Noikev Shem Hashem. That is the Hebrew word for blasphemy, which means cursing the source, as it were. Because Nokev in Hebrew, that word means, the literal meaning is to make finite. When you say about that which is infinite, you give it a finite measure, that's called a curse. Blessing means when the thing that appears to be finite is multiplied and becomes more and more with no limitation. And a curse is when that which should transcend and become more is given a finite edge. Right? The blessing in the female is that she can make a thing definite and make it what we call a davar mesuyov. It's specific and real in the world. To realize, to make real. But the danger in the female pole is that once it becomes real, it becomes specific and frozen and may forget to keep its expanded production going. As soon as you have a world, you have the incredible exhilaration, ecstasy of a world, which incredible in its beauty and depth, and you have the pain of that which is limited having been created. It's no longer can be more than what it is. There are sources that say that when Adam was created, if he had realized, when he opened his eyes and he found himself in a world of inexpressible beauty, had he realized for a moment the limitation of the world, the fact that it is now a separate finite entity, no longer part of the oneness of its source, had he realized that, he would have fulfilled his obligation of exile forever. Because that's called golus. That's called exile. It means being cast into separateness. But of course he didn't. The world... There's nothing in the world that doesn't consist, in case you think this is sort of an abstract, or there's nothing that doesn't consist of it. There's nothing you can ever do or say or think that doesn't automatically have to go through these two processes. There must be the beginning, where the thing has no form, where it could be anything, and then there must be the bringing it in tangible, limited reality. If you're an architect, and you have to build a building. So the first stage is the swirl of ideas. There's so many ways to express the mandate to build something. It could be done in an infinity of ways. And finally, and they're all inspiring, and each one has advantages, and finally he has to settle for just one, because a building can only be one thing. So the blessing of the building is that you have a place to live, and I have the building. But the curse, as it were, is the fact that you don't have all the others that it could have been. Money, for example. Money is power. Because money can be translated into almost anything. But when you've spent the money, so you have the bracha, the blessing, the exhilaration of having bought what you have, but now all the others are not available now, because you spent the currency and there's no more power to buy. These are the two poles. Now the third pole is that concept, and now we get more abstract, that place where the limitation is applied, but in such a way that it is perfect, it's manifest perfectly, but it does not limit the giving in any way. On the contrary, because the limit is set here, it makes the giving perfect. The example would be, probably mentioned this before, the example would be that when the rain falls, that's ultimate chesed. Ultimate kindliness and giving, because the rain contains the source of all bracha, of all blessing. Nothing grows without the rain. In fact, the Hebrew word geshem doesn't only mean rain. That word geshem in Hebrew has got two meanings. One is rain, and the other is the source of all material. Gashmi means, Gashmiut means anything that has physical reality. The rain is the source of all that. So when the rain falls, there's a tremendous expression of this blessing, of this chesed. But if the rain doesn't stop falling, it becomes a flood, which is a complete destruction. And therefore, the rain is a blessing only to the extent that it stops at the right moment. If you stop it too soon, then you haven't given enough. It's not a proper giving. If you stop it too late, then it's a flood and it's destroyed. So the balance that's needed, the unique sensitivity, is that it must stop at exactly the right moment. That reveals that what has fallen and the fact that it now stops are both melt together in what's called bracha. Right? That's the balance. A very difficult thing it takes there's an inner talent, an inner sensitivity that's required in order to put that thing. And we always misjudge that. If you're eating honey, for example, there's only so much honey you can eat before it becomes very, very difficult, if not nauseating. And the way our minds work is we think we have some and we have some more, and we think, and not it. And when you have the next spoon, you realize you long ago passed the point of perfect harmony in balance. And that's how we are. That's how we are. That's the skill. It's an inner faculty, it's a spiritual faculty, it's the faculty of balance, and it's spiritual because it is paradoxical. It is putting two opposites together in such a way that they form a perfect harmony, such that each one becomes... Why? How does this work? And how is this an expression of unity? That in depth. So one has to realize here that the axiom that underlies all of this, we have an axiom that's called Olam Chesed Yibani. The world is built in Chesed. The world consists only of Chesed, of this kindness, this outpouring, this unlimited outpouring of giving. Let's try and explain like this. The 7 things that we're talking about, or 10, whichever process, whichever level of breakdown you're considering it, it always works in such a way that the first one contains all the rest. We're not talking about 7 isolated things. The deepest axiom in Jewish thinking is that all different things are one. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The whole world is only an emanation, a manifestation of oneness. The way this is expressed in a finite world is that when a process begins, we do not conceive of a process that begins with one quality and then another one comes from someplace else as the second. We understand that the first thing that begins to manifest contains the second within it, which really means that the second is an aspect, a quality of the first. Then that becomes manifest. The second contains within it the third. So the third is nothing other than expression of the second, which itself is an expression of the first. It has to be this way if you want to build a world of oneness. So let's understand that. Let's take the first one, Chesed. So stay carefully with me. Are we clear so far? You could have imagined, if you look at a diagram, you'd think, well, there's Chesed on the right, then there's Gvura or limitation on the left, and then there's balance in the middle. You think that the world gets built on these 3 things. But the sages, the source says, Olam Chesed Yibani, the world is built out of kindliness. It doesn't say built of all 3. So, how are there 3 if they're really one? And the answer is this, that just like when a child is born, all the features of the child are laid down in the moment of conception. New things don't happen later. In that moment of conception, in fact, our sources indicate that in the first moment of creation, the whole world was formed. It just took 6 days to be expressed. It's like in the moment of conception, the genes fuse, the child is already coded. Whether it will be a boy or a girl, what color its eyes will be, it's all there. It takes 9 months for those things to become expressed as a child. And then there's a process of birth and it grows further. But in that first moment, it's all there. If you froze it at that first moment and you looked at that fertilized cell, you'd know already that this child's going to have colors, hair like this and eyes like that, and it will look like it's all there. It's very nuclear at that point. It hasn't yet had time to expand and express. It's all there. When those cells start dividing, you want to see this in the body, we call it mipsari echse. You know, when a cell is fertilized in the child, it starts dividing. The beginning of a conception pregnancy. 2 cells, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32. It's a process of rapid growth, and they're all identical, by the way. They're all identical. If you take one of the cells when they're 16, or when they're 32 or 64, and you put it in a separate culture medium, it becomes a whole person. Are you aware of that? Today this is very well known. Today it's done every day in the lab. You take a little ball of cells that will become a child, and you wait until they're 4 or 8 or 16, and you pluck out one of them with a micropipette, just 1/16th, and you isolate it, and it becomes a whole person. It becomes 2 and 4 and 8. It doesn't become a 16th of a person. If you pluck out one cell, you don't get a quarter of a person, sort of this part, grows in a dish, and it doesn't work that way. The cells know, because each cell, even if it's only 1/16th or 1/32nd, each cell contains the totality, so it grows a whole person. And yet, despite the fact that each cell has that complete potentiality, suddenly, sooner or later, the cells somehow set an agreement among themselves to start limiting themselves. And instead of one cell now becoming everything, it just becomes feet. And another cell that had the potential to become everything becomes a head. No one knows yet how the cells agree. They're all identical, for pity's sake. How do they... You've got a whole ball of cells, each of which is identical. And you can prove it by pulling it off and letting it grow, and it doesn't become a head or a foot. It becomes everything. And yet if you leave them all together, sooner or later, some become feet and some become toenails. And if you take the cells that grow toenails, you take one of them and you look at its genes, it has everything. You could take any cell from the body and grow a whole repetition of you. Why you'd want to do that beats me. But if you wanted to make another one of you, you could take any of your cells and grow you again. And yet, that cell in your toes that knows to make toes somehow knows only to make toes. You don't grow eyes in your feet. Even though the cells are perfectly capable of doing that. And no one yet knows how, for that matter, no one yet knows how they know to stop growing when they do. After they've decided to become your nose, for example, after your nose reaches a certain size, they stop growing. No one knows how. No one knows how the cells coordinate their growth so that your nose stops when it does. And your fingers stop when they do. Why don't they just keep going? You understand, although we don't understand it technically and scientifically, we observe that in the first cell, it was only one, there was not only the ability to expand and make identical, there was also the ability to set a limit later. And that must have been there in the cell, in the same power. The same cell that had the power to become more and more and more, also knows how it must stop. You want a more practical application? So, you give charity. Give charity. Jewish idea of charity is that you give with a stop. Meaning, for example, you give someone charity in a way that makes him dependent on you. It's not a complete charity. Because along with the giving is the sense of humiliation of permanent dependence. The correct Jewish way of giving is to give in such a way that you you build the person into independence. Of course, there's a paradox there because there's a pleasure in the giving. On the contrary, some people are very charitable. They don't mind giving as long as I can give. But the correct way of giving is giving in such a way that you can detach yourself from... Do you know, a remarkable thing is, again, the language says it all. The Hebrew word for the verb we use for giving kindness, we say gomel chesed. That's the Hebrew verb. Gomel chasodim, to give kindness. Gomel. The Hebrew word gmul, gomel, the verb that we use for giving, literally means to wean. To wean means to stop giving. To wean means, vayigamal means he was taken off the breast. He stopped nursing. The child was not fed by the mother anymore. The ultimate word of separation from the source of giving is called gomel. So why on earth would you use that verb when you want to use a verb indicating ultimate giving? But can you see the depth and the beauty? The concept is that the real giving is the moment when the mother takes the child and gives him the ability to not need her anymore. The real charitable act is you take a person and make him independent. Right? The real act of parenting is to give the child... The real act of a Torah teacher is to make his students independent. The invalid guru is the one who makes his disciples dependent on him. The correct spiritual teacher is the one who makes his students independent of him. That they shouldn't need him anymore. The Mishnah says, He'emidu talmidim harbe. Raise many disciples. But the Hebrew word he'emidu, to raise many disciples, the literal translation is stand them on their feet. Not your feet, their feet. It doesn't mean raise them so they're dependent on you. It means raise them so they become independent of you. In the giving is the giving of an independence. It's a tremendous paradox there. But that's the real giving. This is why we always, the Jewish mitzvah of tzedakah, the word tzedakah in Hebrew, the Hebrew word tzedakah actually means a combination of kindness, of giving, and of din. And there are many Jewish customs that express that. It's the Jewish custom to announce a commitment to tzedakah before giving it. You know that? In many communities, the custom is, a person's called to the Torah, and you declare an intention to give a certain amount to charity. In some places, they actually say the amount. Why do we do that? Because we want to be put in a situation where the giving has now become an obligation. There's the free will nature of the giving, and there's also the bound, the bind of an obligation, because there's the harmony of those two elements in the giving itself. On the contrary, giving is an act of giving of the self, and yet it's commandment. And you feel those two at the time of the giving. And therefore, of course, there's a sensitivity there, there's a maturity there. That's much easier to give in the way that the recipient is totally dependent. And there's a cruelty in making the recipient not get and just cutting off. But there's a mature sensitivity in being able to give in such a way that independence is given. It can't be put into words. It can't be, there's no formula you can, there's a certain sensitivity. The Chavis Lvav is a famous analogy he uses that the milk is given to the child exactly as much as the child needs. The mother produces as much. If she produced too much, the child would gag and choke. Not enough, the child would be hungry. The relationship is such that the body knows how much to give. Not too much, not too little. That's the real giving. More wouldn't be better. So let's understand. If this is true, it means this. The first quality always contains all the rest. Which means that when the giving begins, it contains its own information about limitation. That means it knows when to stop too. And it knowing when to stop, not later, not sooner, is the third quality. And both of those are only expression of the giving. See, you could misunderstand like this. You can think that the world is established on three principles. The giving, the stopping, and the harmony. Which is more important, you'd say? No, they're all equally important, obviously. That's incorrect. The correct answer is, they are all only expressions of the first one. There's only giving. The reason that you stop the giving is only as an act of giving. When it says, Olam Chesed Yiboni, the world is built on kindness, it means only that. You stop giving, but that too is an act of kindness. Is this clear? Let's try and take it one step deeper. Can we do that? Now, you know what? Let's first take a practical example. Yeah, let's do that. If there's time, we'll look at it deeper. Let's take a practical example. Take a classic relationship. A parent responsible for a child. What are the Jewish principles of child raising? What are the Jewish principles of child raising? Well, after this introduction, I hope that this will be clear. Our classic sources, the expression is like this. This is the Jewish, let's say, definition or full expression of the correct way to deal with a child. Or a student if you're a teacher. It says like this. Lo'elam tahi small doicha. Always let the left hand push away. V'yamin makareves, and let the right hand draw close. Notice that the left hand pushing away, which is the expression of discipline, comes first. And always let the right hand draw near. Right? Now you would say, what does that mean? Well, it means the left hand means discipline. Right? Absolute limitation, structure, form, discipline. Pushing away, saying no. And the right hand means drawing near, which is the expression of ultimate kindness. Giving, saying yes. One obvious question is, how can you express both of those in a relationship with a child or with a student? How can you express both of those fully? If you're saying no and you're pushing away, you're saying no. If you're saying yes and you're giving, you can't. And the answer is not that either one is limited or not fully expressed. The Jewish skill, or the spiritual teacher's skill, or the real parent's skill, is to be able to have proper discipline and real discipline and fully expressed discipline, and yet complete outpouring of love at the same time. How are they not set off against each other? How are they not opposites and conflicts? How do they not conflict with each other? Well, again, I think we've said enough already to begin to understand, but just to perhaps make it a drop clearer. When a parent says no to a child, that has to be as much an act of love as the saying yes, as the giving. Right? If a child is given without limitation, it's just as sure destruction of the child as not giving to the child. Which means that when a parent says no and withholds something from the child, that is every bit as explicit an act of love as the giving to the child. It may be harder to see that way. It may be harder for the immature child to see that. But giving too much is just as destructive as giving too little. And therefore, when the giving begins, it's an act of love. When the stopping takes place, it's just as much an act of love. Because there isn't anything other than Olam Chesed Yibone. There is only that. They both, in fact, are one. The real difficulty in parenting skill is to time it exactly right. So isn't too much given and yet not too little. That's not easy. Of course, it isn't only the timing, it's the consciousness. Saying no and disciplining, there are two tones of voice there. The one tone of voice is the saying no and the discipline. The other tone of voice is the discipline out of love. Okay? If the mother's walking around the kitchen on Friday afternoon, this wouldn't happen to any of you because you're all obviously prepared well in advance. By Thursday your Shabbos is ready and made. Obviously you enter Friday with a serene calmness. But believe it or not, there are some people who, scramble at the last minute. So here's this mother, she's walking around Friday afternoon, she's tense, 5 things are happening at once. There's a little child tugging at her skirt who's got something of momentous importance to discuss, at age of 3. And the mother's doing 5 things at once. Eventually what happens is, there's a explosion, right? Where the mother yells at the child to stop nagging or to be quiet. There are 2 ways to tell a child not to... There's one which is, you must be quiet now because I need quiet. That's not education. There's, you must be quiet now because you need to know when and how to be quiet. That's education. And they're 2 completely different tones of voice there. And the child, when a parent reacts to a child with discipline or with anger, right? Yeah, the child should now not interfere. If it's done because I've lost the end of my patience or because I need quiet now, what the child learns from that is selfishness and lack of control. Where the parent gives the child the indication that you need to be quiet now because you need to know that this is an opportunity to learn consideration, there's a time and a place, etc. It's a completely different tone of voice. The child learns from that love. And therefore, we understand that it's Olam Chesed Yibone. All the dealings with a child have to be Chesed. But they take 2 forms. One is the absolute yes, and the other is the absolute no. Does it mean that either one is not properly expressed? It doesn't mean that discipline, for example, should be complete. A rule is a rule. If there's a rule, we're not going to talk now about education in detail, but just enough to illustrate the theme. The rules should be the rules. There's no reason to bend the rules. There's no reason for a parent not to admit that they were wrong. You can say that. You can say I made a mistake. Why not? The child needs to learn that. But to say I made a mistake, or to say that I misunderstood or something, is very different than bending the rule because the tantrum's gone too far. There's never a reason for that. Of course, the rules have to be wisely chosen. There's no point imposing a rule when the child's too young to observe that rule. That doesn't achieve anything. But where the rules are wisely chosen, the rules must be... children are creatures of rules. Even though the child's nature, the paradox here too, a child's nature is they always try to break the rules. The nature of a child is always to break the rules. But thankfully for most parents, even the children who try to break the rules know that when a child's young enough, you can say to them, when a child says, why do I have to go to bed now? You say, I'm sorry, it's a rule. Now, they'll never observe the rule of their own accord. If any child ever comes to his parent and says, but it's 8 o'clock and I think I'll more or less go to bed now because take his temperature. Because, he's not well. Because whatever the rules are, their nature is to push beyond the rule. But it can be very skillfully used. I came across someone who told me about a teacher in Israel. It's a few years ago now. He taught in a school for children severely disturbed. Severe psychological problems. She was teaching in a school where one of the children in the classroom tried to jump out of the window. It's on the 2nd or 3rd floor. And she was standing at the front of the class. And the child in the back of the classroom climbed up in the window and was about to jump out. And she couldn't cross the classroom in time to get to the child to save him. But she was a gifted teacher, really understood children. So as the child was about to jump, she said to the child in a very stern voice, have you got a note from the headmaster? The child climbed down. He didn't have a note. He didn't know. And as he climbed down, she grabbed him. The child didn't, for a moment he thought, he forgot to bring his note for jumping out the window. So that's a gifted teacher. There's a deeper reason actually here. It's also a detailed subject. There's a deeper reason for the discipline, and that is, it'll take a long time to go through fully, but when children are disciplined, when there's a structure, when they live in an environment that is structured, make no mistake, structure doesn't mean that there's no creativity or sense of freedom or sense of being able to expand or explore the envelope. But when there is a system of structure, say, to put it bluntly, rules, there's a training there that isn't only character building. For example, the seeds are being sown of what should later become self-discipline. And many other things. Children derive a sense of security from a set of rules. Children who have no rules at all become very insecure. But there's a deep reason as well. And that is that when a child is brought up with wise rules, it's an intellectual training, it's a training for later in the quality of truth. Try and explain this briefly. You see, truth, being a seeker for truth, whether it's scientific or in any other area, truth means being able to occupy a set of limitations. If you have to walk the pathways of truth in the world, there are very few pathways that are true compared to the ones that are untrue. For example, if you have to solve a mathematical problem and derive an answer, a solution to the problem, there may be only one correct solution to the problem. There are any number of wrong solutions. Untruth is completely unlimited. Lies are free. There's many as you want. But to be accurate, to match the facts exactly, is ultimately constraining and constrained. A person who wants to develop truth has to develop a sense of limitation. They have to think entirely in the box. That's no contradiction to thinking out of the box. That means they also have to have the creativity to know where to break the rules. But the mind that is ultimately creative is a mind that is creative but within truth. There's no sense in being creative where the rules are broken in untruth. The genius of scientific investigation is that person who knows how to think unconventionally, but constrained by truth. You have an unconventional idea, a wild idea, a radical idea, completely iconoclastic idea. But it has to be that which, although it's unconventional and radical and wild, but it matches up to the rules of truth and logic or whatever and therefore a person who's been brought up in a sense of freedom within rules, the harmony between, right, is a person who will ultimately be able to think both creatively and know when to be unconventional, and yet be able to apply the limitations, right, of the criteria of truth and logic and ultimately morality, which is also ultimately constraining. And that is one of the... But you can hear in this discussion again that the reason for the constraints is only because of the love and the benefit. And then, of course, there's the right-hand side. The right-hand side means that there has to be a deep expression of love, because one of the hardest parts to express it is the rules themselves. But it has to be like that, and many of us, we default on that side too. I would say probably the modern error is more pronounced, probably in the side of discipline. Perhaps not as much in this country, perhaps other countries worse. In the North American environment, it's completely disappeared. It's completely unacceptable. Discipline completely unacceptable. There are no methodologies of discipline left. There's no parents and teachers